This podcast is recorded on stolen and unceded Aboriginal land.
We acknowledge the First Nations and elders of this country and join their calls for justice. Always was, always will be Aboriginal land.
Maybe I can ask you this, but we probably will cut it out. But were you at the show where someone died?
I was not, no.
Can you imagine though? Like, surely if you were that comedian, you're thinking, one day this is going to be material. It's going to be great material.
On the night, there were people saying, not the first time someone's died at the gala. Nah. We're terrible people. Yeah.
Yeah, you guys are really bad.
It was,
anyway.
Yeah, it's pretty brutal. Pretty brutal.
Was it a heart attack or what?
I have no idea, yeah. No one's been like, oh, it's weird that it's strange that this man died. So no.
Okay.
So it's just like, yeah.
Something normal.
I think that happened, yeah. Apparently it happens during Melbourne Theatre Company productions all the time.
Wait, what do you mean?
Well, just the demographic of people going to MTC shows is really getting on there.
Wow.
A lot of matinees. A lot of stuffed matinees, yeah.
God. Okay, good. Anyway. That's me because I'm a Greens member. I love war.
War. What is it good for? Winning votes.
Winning elections, yeah. It's not funny given real wars going on, but
no.
What can we do? Hi, I'm Emerald. That's Tom. And this is Serious Danger, a podcast about green politics in Australia, but you know that because this is a Patreon episode. And if you signed up as a Patreon, you didn't even know what the show is, then bless you. Thank you, I guess, but that would be kind of weird. But thanks for being a Patreon subscriber. We got a few requests for this one. We had a few DMs on the Instagram. I don't know if you also heard from people, Tom, wanting to talk about the Greens becoming warmongering imperialists while we looked away for 1 second and suddenly they want to kill everyone with drones or something. But yes, we thought it was worth kind of digging into because I feel like there has been it is rare that the Greens get critique from their left, and it's always kind of an interesting opportunity to have a look at ourselves. And I think it's good that someone is holding the Greens to account from the left, but I also feel like a lot of the critique maybe seems to be based on just like hypothesizing or even like a little bit of a conspiratorial tone about what the policy actually is that may not genuinely apply. But
yeah, a little bit of headline journalism, I'd say. People staffing a headline and saying like, this is why this sucks and this is all you need to know about this particular story, which I think hopefully through this episode we can explore that that's not exactly the full story. Hopefully we don't come across as hacks and apologists in the course of doing that. I don't think that's going to happen.
Which I'm obviously scared about. Whenever I find myself I'm always like looking at myself going, are you just thinking this because you're a hack? But I've looked, like I have taken the time to like read a bunch of critiques of this policy announcement and watch some videos and have conversations with people. And I think where I land is that like the critiques that are being raised by the left, and a lot of them are coming, like seems to be coming a lot from the Victorian Socialists, but there are other folks as well. But like they're valid points. I just don't necessarily think that they apply to this policy.
Yeah.
So,
okay.
Yeah.
That's handy. Can I just say, I mean, we probably would have got into this with Nick McKim on the weekly episode last week if the election hadn't also been called. So the whole thing kind of got swamped in that noise. That was just myself and Nick. This is the first time folks will be hearing from you since the election has been called. Emerald Moon.
Oh, yeah.
How are you going? How are you feeling? What's been going on in Greens HQ where you run the show?
Yeah.
What's been happening?
Yeah, I'm just glad. I'm glad the election's been called. I didn't think it was going to be that election. I had scheduled my 30th birthday party for that weekend. I mean, thought it wasn't going to be that weekend. Had to move that.
I haven't got invited, so this is awkward. Pretty fucked
you're going to
up.
fly up. I'll send you the invitation then, Tom. I'd love to have you there. This is great. Invited live on air.
Is there going to be any alcohol or drugs there?
The audience is going to hold you. Look, you can bring alcohol and drugs if you want. If you want, I guess, to the park where there will be children, but sure. But anyway, yes, it's now the election will happen and then my birthday will happen and either I'll be in a better mood because things went well or I'll need a distraction.
Yes.
So kind of works out either way. But yeah, went to the Keep Dutton Out, Keep Brisbane Green rally, which then effectively became a de facto campaign launch just because of the timing. And that was very energizing and fun. And we had lots of people heading out to Dornoch right afterwards, even though it was pouring rain. So yeah.
Oh, wow. Good news. Well, we'll be winning heaps more people to the Greens cause, particularly people who want to bomb the Middle East with this new policy. So let's get into it.
The key, yeah.
Key
demographic.
demo.
That's right. That's what we've been missing. Well, according to Advance, or News Corp. Anyway, okay, so this is from the ABC, I guess about a week ago. No, well, it's a week ago when we were recording this. Sorry, it's probably a while ago now when you're hearing this. Sorry about that. Anyway, the ABC says, Greens policy to make drones and missiles as a, quote, credible plan B to replace AUKUS. That's the headline. It starts, for the first time in the party's history, the Australian Greens have unveiled a formally costed policy to fund new military programs for locally made, quote, defensive weapons, while also pledging to slash billions of dollars in spending on American technology. Now, I have to say, so first of all, this is the first time the Greens have ever released a fully costed defence policy. That's kind of wild, isn't it?
Well, it's hard to figure out what they mean by that because at the last election, the policy was to reduce spending to 1.5% of GDP, right? Doesn't that count as a defence policy?
Well,
is the difference that it's fully costed? I don't know.
Kind of. I think that's the difference. I think what they're saying is that the Greens have taken a proposal to the Parliamentary Budget Office and gone, hey, can you cost this? And then we'll propose it. Whereas I think the 1.5% of GDP is just a number that they put out there as that would be their proposal.
Well, yeah. Well, I'm sorry. Cutting funding to defence is a defence policy. I know it's not the policy you're supposed to have or you're allowed to have, and the political consensus says that's ridiculous. What are you talking about? More money for guns and weapons, please. But no, saying, hey, we're actually spending way too much money on this, and it's pulling us into illegal wars and killing heaps of people, and it's really bad, and we could actually afford to reduce the amount of public money that we put into this death industry. That's a legitimate defence policy. So it's fine by me.
Well, having said that as well, I always I knew the 1.5% figure, hadn't actually looked at how much we're currently spending. It's not even that much of a significant drop. In 2023 to 2024, Australian defence spending was 2% of GDP. Treasury expects it will reach 2.4% in 2027 to 28 financial year. So it's not even as though the Greens were slash it by even half at the time, which is interesting, I guess, particularly given the, whatever the word is, the narrative on the back of this policy announcement that the Greens have abandoned some sort of abandoned their peace and nonviolence principles effectively to unveil a dramatically more military intensive spending platform for ahead of this election. And that doesn't seem to be the case from what I can see. Yeah.
Now, there's a lot of talk about 3%. I don't know if it's coalition policy to get 3%, but certainly people are talking about that. Everyone's sort of saying that, particularly with America's retreat. Yes. But I think even the EU and stuff, that's the number. Again, there's all just sort of fucking arbitrary numbers, to be honest. As long as it's more, the military industrial complex is as long as there's more money, then that's fine. But 3% does seem to be the number that's been thrown around. And certainly I think it might be coalition policy to get us to that, at least to 2.5. Right. I think that's certainly there. But yes, long-standing Greens policy.
Giving it a good crack, 378 billion or whatever it is, 375 billion on AUKUS is a good way to get your GDP, your proportion of GDP spending on defence up, isn't it?
Fucking get there, yes. But yes, as opposed to what you might have heard or what people might have presumed, under Greens policy for quite a long time, the ADF would still exist. There would still be an army being funded by
light and readily deployable, as they always say, though, which has always been a little bit what does that mean? And this is what I think is interesting about this, is they're this is part of what we mean. It's one of the first times, really the first time for me, that I have felt oh, you're actually telling me what you mean. Even as an obvious Greens hack supporter, I'm great, I agree, we need to spend way less on military expenditure, and we need to take a more, and we need an independent foreign policy, we need a peace-based approach, a non-aggressive approach, but what does that mean?
Mm.
So what they're saying, so this most recent policy announcement, they'd already announced that they're going to cancel AUKUS. Now what they've said is they'll also scrap other procurement contracts with US arms manufacturers, specifically for M1A2 tanks and Black Hawk helicopters. They said that those things together, and I believe this is over the forward estimates or 4 years, would save $77 billion. So the proposal is to take $4 billion of that $77 billion in savings from reduced military expenditure and put that towards domestic defense manufacturing. And that would include what they call uncrewed marine and aerial vehicles, aka drones, as well as short and medium range missiles. Importantly, they're saying that those missiles would not leave Australia's shores. So that's what they mean by being purely for defensive purposes.
Gotcha. And the remaining $73 billion is redirected to other good stuff to make people's lives better, right?
Housing,
Health, education, climate.
Exactly.
Yeah, gotcha.
Yeah. And keeping in mind the Greens also, they still want to cancel all existing contracts with Israeli arms manufacturers. Ultimately, and I'm not sure if this is like part of what they put out towards the election, but I've seen in some of the Greens materials that the objective is to ultimately stop selling parts to the US, which we know are then used in aggressive wars by the US military, including places like Gaza, to close all foreign military bases in Australia, extremely important and something that seems to be directly misreported, I would say, in a lot of the critique of the Greens' position. They're acting as though the Greens support foreign military bases in Australia, which is like the Greens have a strong history of opposing. And the Greens also want to ban the use of lethal autonomous drones. Shout out to my sister who did an episode on killer robots. For those who remember, for the real danger dogs, go back and listen to that episode. I don't know what number it was.
It's kind of tricky. Like the term drones really is such an umbrella term that covers a lot of different stuff, right? I mean, yes, killer drones, attack drones, surveillance drones. I mean, yeah, there are a lot of people that admit it. I mean, they're basically all pretty evil, I suppose. But there are some drones are less evil than others. I think that's fair to say.
I think so. Well, and specifically though, when we say we want to ban lethal autonomous, when we say autonomous, I think they mean like a human is not making the decision.
Oh, God. Yeah,
not
great.
as in they're remote controlled, but yeah.
Terminator cop stuff. Right. And the guiding principle here is about an independent foreign and military policy, right? Disentangling ourselves from US empire, because that is at the heart of so many of these problems that gets us caught up in these conflicts overseas, that means that we don't have sovereignty, that we don't have the ability to make our own decisions as a country when it comes to matters of defense and conflicts overseas. It's about saying, what does it actually look like to unravel ourselves from American empire? And yes, according to the Greens, to this policy, that would involve allocating some money to things that would defend us if we happen to be attacked literally on our actual country where we live.
Yes. Our island on which we live.
Yes, actual defense, like actually using the term defense to mean actually defending the place where we live. Yes.
Yeah. And maybe we'll get into this more, but I think that's like, it is helpful to remind people that like we are a literal island in the middle of the sea. And I think when you're comparing Australia to other countries, like what a genuinely defensive military might look like for Australia is going to be different than other countries. Because literally if we say we're only going to have short and medium range missiles and our weapons are not going to leave our shores, we actually can't reach anyone. Like it's that, and the risk of us being invaded is very low because it would probably not work out very well for anyone who tries to mount a ground offense on Australia. You know what I mean? So like,
well, have you read War on Tomorrow? I mean, the War on Tomorrow series laid it out pretty clearly that when those evil foreigners were going to come and take over stuff, it'd only come down to a group of plucky teenagers to resist and fight back.
But this is the irony, like I mean, the idea that, yes, China is going to come and attack us is, in my view, pretty bloody spurious. But that doesn't mean that, like I guess I do believe, like I think that I agree with the idea of having a defense force. And maybe that's a question. Like maybe just up top, I'm like, do you think that we should have a defense force at all?
Oh boy. I mean,
Did I get there too early?
yeah. Well, I guess I'm reticent because it's hard to say what I think. I appreciate, and again, we'll get to these critiques. It's easy to say, and it's a completely legitimate line of argument to say that the presence of a military is a warmongering vibe, right? Like the existence of the vibes are off. The existence of an army, the building up of defense capacity is what fuels war and leads us into conflicts, as well as, of course, global capitalism, which inevitably, leads us into competition and conflict with other nation states. So that's what it seems to me where Victorian socialists would be coming from, a critique that I have a lot of sympathy for. But I mean, during the Second World War, Japan did fully come into Australian water space. They totally did arrive. So it has happened in the past. That's a real thing. Now, you could argue that, our alliance with other Western powers in that conflict is exactly what brought that invasion to our shores. So that's sort of another part of the conversation. But I feel like we jump a few steps if we say, we should live in a world of peace, therefore we shouldn't have any defense capabilities whatsoever. Feels like, jumping a few steps to get to the world that we want. And then I say that and I feel like a centrist Labour hack.
No, I don't know. I think it also, I think the only way that I can get to that we shouldn't have a defense force is if we believe, if your ideology is that the nation state is inherently should be abolished and that borders should be abolished. And there are many people who would say that that is inherent to a genuinely socialist position. I still don't really know where I fall on that. I kind of agree that borders are fake in a way, but they do, people form nation states. That's the way it is. So I'm I think if and while we have a nation state, having defensive capabilities that are genuinely defensive does make sense. But I agree that, if we were getting to the point where we're breaking down the nation states, then maybe that wouldn't make sense anymore.
Yeah, and I think there are examples of other countries, particularly from the social democratic world, that have standing military capabilities that remain neutral and haven't been involved in any kind of conflict at all. Now, that's changing a lot, obviously, with the situation of NATO and Europe and that kind of conflict, but, it's not impossible to imagine that kind of future. Or imagine that kind of status quo, I suppose.
Yes. So let's talk about the criticism. I think that the main three, kind of lines of attack that people have taken on this policy is, first of all, that effectively more weapons equals more war. That yes, there's no way to say you're going to build more weapons, but it's only defensive. It's that is militarism. And it's ultimately going to be used as an aggressive force. The second is that that's a poor use of money. You shouldn't be spending $4 billion on weapons or equipment of war when you could be spending it on housing, health, etc. And the third is that basically is kind of a meta critique that the only reason that the Greens would be doing this is out of this kind of cynical electoralism or a capitulation to the centre or the right in order to secure and grow their vote. So I think
also vote for me.
Well, yeah. The fact that and I looked and there are a couple of there is a piece, there's one from Oscar Grenfell, who's not Victorian Socialist, who's World Socialist website, some other organisation. But otherwise it's a lot of Victorian Socialists criticising this. And so it did feel, it felt odd for part of that attack to be well, this is because the Greens are just electoralists when you are a registered political party. But I think that the Victorian Socialists argue that well, we're only doing electoralism as a means to an end. And once we've built up this base of support, we can then grow a movement that can genuinely challenge capitalism. Whereas they say that the Greens, for them, electoralism is the end game. And frankly, I disagree. I know a lot of people, and in fact, the people who are making real change and driving a lot of the Greens are not just there for electoralism. They genuinely have the exact same theory of change, which is that you build up a social movement that is capable of challenging capitalism. So I fundamentally reject that premise from the Victorian Socialists. And I find it frustrating when that is used as as the underlying foundation of their arguments, because I'm but that's just it's not true. Like maybe it's true for some Greens, but it's just not fundamentally true for what the Greens are, which is a collection of people, and many of those people don't subscribe to that view, you know?
Mm. Yeah, and frustrating when, like, the Victorian Socialist is a political project that, from my understanding, arose out of various socialist groups in Victoria's frustrations, failure, recognition that they weren't making a lot of progress, that they weren't speaking to a lot of people. I have a huge amount of respect for a whole bunch of those people, including the revolutionary socialist people who are, turn out. These are the people who organize and turn out rallies, who get their heads fucking bashed in by cops because they're standing up for what they believe in very important causes. Got nothing but love and respect for that. But the VS as a political party, which is, gaining some traction and having some real wins, which is also really impressive and encouraging. We've talked about that before on the show.
Yeah.
But, they created this political party for a reason, to win votes, to get to raise awareness, to avoid that horrible phrase, but to try and, get explicitly socialist candidates elected, to take away that kind of taboo, I suppose. And again, I got nothing but love and respect for that as well. But it does seem, I do feel like there's a fundamental contradiction in their arguments that electoralism sucks and the parliament is evil, everyone. Vote one, vote for Victorian Socialist. It's a little bit confusing.
I get their argument that they're like, we're only doing electoralism because we have to, and that's not the end game. And the Greens aren't like that. But I disagree that the Greens and BS have different approaches there. But anyway. So this was the tweet from Victorian Socialist account, quote, "A disappointing announcement from the Greens. The history of past arms races shows clearly you won't win a peaceful world by investing in weapons and war. However much you claim it to be for, quote, purely defensive purposes, and arms spending is almost always justified in this way." There was another, I think this has come through in a number of communications from Victorian Socialist, posts and things like that, basically saying, well, I don't, this buys into the idea that the ADF is a defensive military, when its history shows that it's an aggressive force, and citing things like, Iraq, Afghanistan, Timor-Leste, Vietnam, whatever. And I'm like, yes, I don't think that – I actually think what this policy does is the opposite of buying into the idea that the ADF is a defensive force. I think what this policy does is say, hey, the way that the ADF is currently structured, where it's dependent on the US primarily, and that is reflected in our procurement processes as well as the weapons that we kind of equip the ADF with, that is bad and has led us down this aggressive path that has not only led to enormous, human cost, but is now putting us at risk of heightened aggressions with China and in the Indo-Pacific region. And so we need an alternative to that, which would be a force that is purely stationed on our shores, cutting ties with US manufacturers, cutting ties with I've literally just forgotten the name. Israel.
Wow.
If only I could. I could. Forever.
Yeah. God damn.
Anyway, cutting ties with Israel. Yeah. But that's
Don't cross this bitch, she will straight up forget your name.
But that's what I mean. I'm like, the Greens are literally saying the ADF is currently an aggressive force and that's bad. Let's not do that. So I feel like this argument that this is the way that the military has been done, in a sense, yes, there's an argument that's we'll be realistic. When governments say they're going to be defensive, that's just used as an excuse to expand militarism that ultimately ends up being an aggressive force and, not friendly Geordies, the other Geordies.
Israel.
Really good with names this afternoon. No, Purple Pingers, Jordan Van Den Lam, the socialist Geordies.
Yes.
He said in a video, we know what these weapons will be used for, to kill working class people in other countries. But I'm like, but that's fundamentally, that's what the Greens are saying we shouldn't do.
Shouldn't do, please. Look, again, I have a lot of sympathy. The slippery nature of the term defense is absolutely something to be conscious of and to call out, right? And so, yes, during the height of the war on terror, we had this insane situation and people said, well, we need to invade Iraq because that's to defend our interests, defend our way of life, to keep us safe, you see. We're at war with terror. And so we need to go over here, kill a million Iraqis in order to protect us at home. It, of course, made us far less safe and was a terrible offensive move that that undermined our own defense and our own safety as a country. So again, I completely understand that argument, but I suppose it comes back to, okay, so if we all agree on that, we all agree that adventurers overseas furthering imperialism and funding that kind of activity is bad. We can agree on that. Greens and VS and all the left. What does it actually mean? If the word defense is to have meaning, what does that actually mean, and what does that actually look like in a domestic sense? Yes, Shoebridge and the Greens would argue that is possible. VS would probably say, nah, you got these weapons, they'll end up being used somehow, and they'll be used to further international capitalism and US imperialism.
Yeah, and I don't know if people will find this a strange analogy to draw, but it reminds me a lot of the discourse around like rent caps, for example, where everyone goes, well, when rent caps have been used, stick with me here.
Yeah.
When rent caps are used, they are perverted by this like profit-driven, exploitative, capitalistic system or a government that doesn't genuinely care about affordable housing for people, and they're implemented in such a way that actually drives up rents or doesn't work or whatever. And it's like, well, yes, that's because they had a bad policy that wasn't actually what it said it was. But they say, well, see what happened, and so the Greens rent caps are bad. And it's like, no, but the Greens rent caps are actually what you want, and the policy lays out exactly how they would achieve that. And I feel like this is a similar thing where they go, well, this other entity said they were going to do this and they didn't do it. So when the Greens say that they are going to do it, we shouldn't believe them. And like, I guess fair enough. It's good to be cynical. If you see a political party going, we're going to manufacture drones purely for defensive purposes, it is worth digging into the details. But then when the answer is given to you, to then be like, well, it's impossible. It's like, okay, fuck. Well then, okay, don't bother, I guess.
Don't worry about anything. I think it's also worth saying that the idea of the Australian Defence Force being an actually defensive army of Australia, the continent, the island, the place where we live, and not being involved in foreign wars and not being used overseas to help out America is the idea of what the ADF should be for the vast majority of Australians, right? Like I think the overwhelming majority of ordinary people would think, yes, happy to have an army. We do need to be protected. Keeping us safe is important. We hate all this overseas shit, right? This interventionism has proven to be a total disaster. We've been seeing that for a long time. Australia's defence force involvement from Vietnam to Iraq to Afghanistan to all of it is real bad, and we should all the ADF should be used to, protect Australia here and now. I would say that's a very common and ideal perception of what the ADF should be for most Australian citizens. I'd put that out there. Also, I think it's worth saying that this, I think you can make a pretty strong argument that this is not a militarization policy. This is about demilitarization, right? I know that it's redirecting money into the manufacture of drones and missiles, okay, but we're talking about reducing military spending by $73 billion over the forward estimates, right? Like under the Greens plan, the amount of money going towards defense to the international war machine would be reduced to zero, but to defense generally would be dramatically reduced. And I think that's an important difference, I suppose. Perhaps VS wouldn't take that point, but I think that's worth saying.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose I think it's fair to critique a policy if you're saying it doesn't go far enough. Like if they're saying, well, we should be cutting military expenditure to zero. But I don't know if that's Victorian Socialist policy. And I looked up their policy page, and it is like strikingly similar to the Greens policy on defence. Like the preamble is all about, it says Australia's role in all this thus far has been shaped by our alliance with the United States. That's led to our involvement in these wars. It says we should oppose Australian involvement in greater power rivalries or imperialist conflicts, withdraw from all alliances with major imperialist powers, and pursue a policy of non-alignment. And then it just says cut military funding and redirect it to housing, healthcare, education. And I don't know whether cut, like I guess you could interpret cut, maybe that means cut altogether. But I think you could argue that the Greens policy, I think it would be reported as cutting military funding, right? Because it is cutting expenditure. So it's not clear to me like whether the VS policy is to have no spending on military, like no military expenditure. And I guess like I think if you're going to do the whole realpolitik thing and go, well, we need to be realistic that if we build these weapons, they will be used in this way because that's the way that things have worked, then you kind of need to take it the other direction and go, well, if we cut all military expenditure, then this is what is going to happen. Australia's going to be vulnerable because that's the way of the world right now under capitalism and imperialism. Like, that's kind of the limitation of realpolitik in a way. Like this kind of trapping ourselves and being like, well, this is the way that things have always been done, and so we can't hope for anything better. No alternative. I think it's important to paint an alternative, like to build, to, I guess, present what your alternative future is if you disagree with the current system.
Yeah. It's funny how you find yourself reaching for the same lines that you hear wielded us from Labor. As you say, getting critique from the left is a new and novel experience for us. It's great.
No, for sure. Yeah, for sure. Yeah. I mean, I think one, like, even just on a factual basis, there was this very fiery article on World Socialist website, this Oscar Grenfell writer, and it's well written, but it is,
World Socialist website is, I think World Socialist website think that Victorian socialists are a sellout.
They called
capitalist.
They refer to like
psyop.
The fake socialist groups, like Socialist Alternative and Socialist Alliance. They're really, I don't know what the go is here.
Come
this
on.
splinter group.
Can't we all just get along, Emerald?
No, we can't. No,
okay.
He's going, the Greens have dropped their vague mask of pacifism, outlining a program for major military build-up in preparation for war. Just obviously not true. But he's pointing out, he says that they said the missiles should be medium range or to intermediate, so going up to 5,500 kilometers of range. But just to be clear, I don't think that's actually what's proposed. They've said short to medium range. So that would only go up to maximum like 3,000 kilometers. And so when this article says that the Greens missiles, presumably stationed on the northern approaches, could be fired into the Indo-Pacific, like if we're talking about China, which let's be real, that's what the overarching, what's the word, assumption of this is there going to be a war with China? Do we need to kind of adopt this aggressive stance, this military posture to defend against China? But no, you can't reach China based on my Googling of distance between Australia and China. Would maybe reach, like Indonesia. But I think that's a bit of a stretch.
Yeah, I think we can pop the World Socialist website in a certain box that we don't have to worry about. I think there's been some more better faith critiques coming from VS. Yeah.
Sure. I think it was worthwhile. Like if you're like me, that I don't know, when I hear something like this and I want to get all the information and like hear what people are worried about so that I can understand it for myself, I'm like out there Googling all critiques of this. And then I see that and I go, wait, that does seem wrong. And then that's why I check it, Yeah. So, okay. The Victorian Socialists.
I just imagine you Googling, can Australia hit China with missile?
No. I Googled distance between China and Australia.
Okay. All right. Good.
In kilometers. Yeah.
Can we make China go boom boom ? Search.
Yeah. ? That's right. China equal good, bad. Look,
missile is socialism ? Yeah.
The thing is, like some of the Victorian Socialist critiques as well, they were like, and the Greens are saying this is just a first step. There could be more to come, more military expenditure. I would read when David Shoebridge, who announced this, said this is a, quote, first step for the reorganisation of our defence force. I take that to mean this is a first step in demilitarisation, like in adopting an independent policy that is purely defensive rather than aggressive, right?
Right. Yes, this is a first step in our broader policy to disentangle ourselves from the US imperial military complex and, yes, demilitarize and have independent sovereign military policy, which includes limiting our spending of defense to 1.5% of GDP.
Well, we've dropped that.
Oh, we've dropped that. Okay, right.
Yes. So the 1.5 limit actually that's not what the Greens are taking to the election now. They're saying we're going to cut these specific programs.
I see.
That's going to save this specific amount. And I guess that's the other point, like and there is a very valuable and important argument whenever you hear anything about defense spending to go $4 billion, could that not be spent better? But I think like the fact that $73 billion of those savings are going towards public services and $4 billion is part of this, the first step in a reorientation away from reliance on foreign arms manufacturers and the US, I think that's reasonable.
Yeah. So we haven't. So the new policy doesn't involve a limit on spending as a proportion of GDP necessarily. Okay, I understand.
Yeah.
Thank you. See, I'm learning too, everyone.
No worries. Yeah. Okay. So then maybe we get into come back to this, I guess, electoralism argument, because Purple Pingers, aka Jordan Vanden Lam, tweeted, "The Greens now want to manufacture missiles to end AUKUS. Fuck's sake, we can just end AUKUS. We don't have to replace it with anything. Are they afraid of losing voters to the Teals or something? This is ridiculous." And I watched this video, and he spends actually a good chunk of the video just more broadly on like a bit of a criticism of the Greens and that question of whether they are looking to build a mass movement or not. He said the Greens just want to improve capitalism and they don't have any issue with capitalism. I disagree.
Yes.
I really disagree.
We're different.
But
we don't believe that.
Sure, that's, I guess you could say there are people in the Greens who have that stance. But then, he's saying that the Greens are positioning themselves as a centrist party in order to counter the threat from the Teals. So the Teals are coming after the well-educated, wealthy, kind of tree-Tory Greens base and kind of shifting the Greens to the right in order to compete with them. And I actually haven't heard this critique before. Is this something that's been like swimming around in Victoria, or is this the first time you've heard this? You seem unimpressed.
I find it hard to track this thought. Maybe I'm like a Labor voter going to Vote Compass, putting in my beliefs and being told that I'm a Greens voter, except I'm a Greens voter going and being told that I should vote for Victorian Socialist.
Oh, Victorian Socialist, right. Sorry.
I'm outraged. How dare you say that I'm not as left-wing as you? Gosh. It seems like the Greens policy when it comes to defence, cutting AUKUS and disentangling ourselves from the United States of America, to present that as an appeal to try and win voters from the right seems to me an ultra-leftist position. That seems out of whack, I would say. Okay, because from the VS point of view, this is a policy to their right, even though we can have quibbles with that because we don't think they've actually engaged with the detail of what the policy is about. They would say that it's illustrative of the Greens becoming more conservative and saying, "Oh, we don't want to scare people away too much, so we need to give some money towards drones and missiles." Again, I do think that there's a lack of engagement with what this policy is actually about.
Yeah,
a reimagination and a reorganisation of what Australian Defence Forces would actually look like. And this is still pretty fucking radical, guys. Like, we're talking about America disentangling itself from America. Closing military bases, cancelling a $368 billion military contract. Like, this is still a very big deal, okay? This is not a stop to the right.
That's what, like, I don't think that the Greens did this to appease Teal voters. I think they thought, like, if I'm going to be honest, I think the mistake that the Greens made was not foreseeing adequately, if at all, this critique from the left. I think the Greens probably went into this announcement going, how do we protect ourselves from the attacks on the right that are going to come when we say cancel all these contracts, literally like cut $73 billion of spending from defence over the next 4 years and just focus on defensive military equipment that's not going to leave our shores. Like, they're going to say we're ridiculous and we hate Australia and we're not serious, and how do we counteract that? I think that is the mistake, because I don't think the Greens were ready to respond, it seemed to me, to the criticism that they got from the left. But that to me says that they weren't thinking, okay, well, this is it, like our big shift to the right, like everyone's going to notice and all the Teals are going to vote for us now. It just doesn't quite line up with the way that this kind of played out, I guess.
Yeah. Again, I find it difficult to see it as anything other than kind of an ultra-leftism. I mean, again, as you said before, this to me is the Greens putting meat on the bones. They're saying this is what we actually mean, right? This is when we're talking about changing and reimagining, reorganizing what Australia's defence force would actually look like. This is what it would mean to stop entangling ourselves with America, right? It would if you back out of contracts with American weapons manufacturers, and you believe that Australia should have a defence force of some kind, and that's perhaps the sticking point that we've discussed, then what is that going to look like? You're going to have to reallocate funds for domestic manufacture of things like drones and missiles to be used purely in our self-defense. Okay. Now, it sounds like on the Victorian Socialist website, they've got the other version of that, which is just like the military is bad. Yes, imperialism is awful. International capitalism is terrible. None of this is in the interests of the Australian working class. So we definitely shouldn't put more money towards defense spending. But, and there seems like there's a bit of a blank there, what would the Victorian Socialist version of the ADF budget look like?
Yeah. No, I don't know. I guess though, I'm curious, what do you mean by ultra leftism? Because I guess I also think there's an element of, this read on green strategy that buys into the idea that the electorate is kind of moving right, or like is more right wing than maybe they are. Because to my mind, I think that the Greens' response to the Teals has always been, oh, there's a big gap in their offering to the Australian people, and that's a social democratic platform. And the Greens have been like quite open in leaning into that and saying, yeah, look, the Teals, maybe they can offer you some good stuff on integrity and climate, but they're not fundamentally transforming the economic system that is like crushing ordinary, everyday working people, renters, And that to me is like, that's a far more leftist position to be like, that is what people want and that's what we're pursuing. Yeah, like you're adopting the centrist mindset in saying that the Greens would need to do that in order to win votes, I guess is what I'm saying. And I don't think that the Greens are adopting that mindset. You're kind of just making it up for them. You're just like hypothesizing that that's what they're trying to do, perhaps.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I mean, my understanding, and I could be wrong, and if people correct me on this, ultra leftism is adopting a position that's further to the left of any position that is then that is proposed.
Right, just for the sake of it, basically.
For the sake of it, yes.
Okay.
And I think what we're seeing here is again things that seem to come up constantly in the debate between revolutionary socialists, democratic socialists, and social democrats, right?
Yeah.
And the very tricky question that I don't have a firm position on, which is, how do you organize your politics? Do you base your policy and positions around your absolute perfect vision of the world? How much do you factor in the realities of what Australian politics looks like now, the material realities for people's lives, how much change people can talk about, how normal you need to seem when you're talking to other people about the kind of political project that you're talking about? These are all very big, messy questions. I'm not proposing that I've got firm solutions on them whatsoever. But again, I'd come back to the idea that this defense policy, if it got the serious interrogation and media coverage that we would love it to have, I think it would have very broad appeal. And it doesn't seem to be a massive capitulation to the forces of global capital. That's another thing. It's like if this policy was enacted, the forces of global capital would hate it very much.
Yes.
So I also don't take that critique.
I think to your question, that dilemma about, how do you kind of build your politics or your policies? I think if you are a political party seeking government, and that's the purpose of both Victorian Socialists and the Australian Greens policy platforms specifically, not just talking about their movements and all the things they do generally.
They wouldn't say government. I don't think Victorian Socialists are.
Sure, sorry.
Would say they're running to form government.
If you're creating policies, these are the policies that you're saying that the government should enact, right?
Yeah.
And so you need to assume that there's still a government. And you can put your political theory of change can be that we pursue this electoral project, we gain power, we implement these policies through a state that change people's lives, and that ideally build worker power, build the power of ordinary people to then challenge even perhaps the institution of the state itself and create self-sustaining, worker-led communities where everyone has the things that they need to live a good life. But I guess, for the part of that theory of change that includes, using the government to implement policies, those policies probably need to be at that point in the timeline, right? Which is why it makes sense for you to assume that there's a state at that point.
Yeah. I mean, again, I think it's a contradiction. You talk about how people need to, tear down the state and the government sucks and we shouldn't worry about electoralism. And they'll organize rallies, and those rallies overwhelmingly involve demands on the government, right? They are calling on the government to do shit. Which
is very reasonable.
Which is totally reasonable, but it does imply that it seems like, whoever's making the government does kind of matter, I suppose.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think that I don't think that Victorian Socialists would say, like, it doesn't matter who's in government. I think they're just saying that we have different end goals, and that I actually still disagree with. But,
right.
Yeah.
But you got to say, like, as long as they call themselves the Victorian Socialists, and as long as the Greens still aren't full-throated or forthcoming with their position on the question of capitalism, they're always going to be able to take this position, right? And
for sure.
Full credit to them. And I love the idea that someone called a socialist explicitly would be elected to the Australian Parliament. I think that would be cool. That would mean something. That would do something. And I wish that the Greens was a little bit more upfront about where they're at. Adam's out there talking about, our platform, this election is to the beating social democratic heart that's out there in Australia. We like that. Of course, social democracy can exist, obviously, within capitalism, very much so. But, being a bit more on the front foot about that stuff would be cool.
Well, I think, we can't pretend that Victorian Socialists aren't to the left of the Greens. They are to the left. Like, I think, there are some, Labor hacks when critiquing the Greens will sometimes be like, well, the Greens aren't even a left-wing party. They're not actually to the left of Labor. Labor's the one for the workers. I think it would be pretty cringe of me to sit here and say, no, Victorian Socialists aren't even actually to the left of the Greens. Absolutely they
We're
are.
the real leftists.
Yeah, that's right. That's obviously bullshit. That's a openly socialist party with good policies, good people doing good work, and saying correct shit about military policy and this kind of question. I think my issue is when you say things about the Greens and their policies that are just not true.
Not true.
There's also, I think
you're about to get to this, but I mean, he went a little bit further too, and he's talks broadly about the Greens having no ideology whatsoever, and that this is entirely a bid to win votes, which I'm a little bit like.
I almost didn't even want to include this because I'm not really sure where this is coming from, right? Because, Purple Fingers has done a fair bit of work with the Greens, and you would think he wouldn't do this if he believed this, but he says in this video that the Greens have no ideology on housing. They don't have an ideology on housing. They're purely, presenting and fighting for housing policies for renters and whatnot for votes, which I think is a really kind of a disappointing thing to say. And I think that anyone on the face of it can see that that's not the case. And again, I go back to who are the Greens? We're the Greens. We write the policies. We make shit happen. And I have a fucking ideology on housing. Don't that actually pisses me off because I'm literally the first door knock I went to, as I've said, we were talking about renting and I was like, oh, fuck, this is me. Wow, I have been renting my whole life and this is important to me. And I want to be part of this project to to support renters so that I don't feel like I'm walking on a fucking tightrope every day of my life and other people don't have to as well. And I think really for anyone who seriously buys the line that Max Chandler Mather, for example, is just talking about renters for votes, I mean, there's a little bit of a, that's a real level of cynicism that I think I don't even really know what to say to that because it's just quite plainly not true, right?
Yeah.
That's
not true.
Yeah, that's why I'm I don't even know where to. Yeah.
Yeah, and let's be real. Jordan's campaign to win a Senate seat in Victoria would if it's successful, would come at the cost of the Victorian Greens vote. He's clearly trying to win.
Yeah.
More Greens votes over to help his campaign too, right? He's saying that by doing stuff he believes. I'm not doubting the stuff that he believes whatsoever, but that
you're saying he might just be saying that even though he knows it's untrue in order to win Greens votes.
Well, he might also be getting that candidate brain thing in which you just start doing. Well, I mean, there's a reason why he's not running for the Greens, right? There's a reason why he's chosen the Victorian Socialists.
Yeah, but I would think that that's because he believes that Victorian Socialists more closely reflect his values, which I think is true. And that's fine. I just, yeah, it surprises me that you would be like, no one in the Greens cares about housing.
Yeah.
Kind of insane.
It's putting a bit of mayo on there.
Yeah.
And what do you think about the article? There's a piece from Declan Ferber-Gillick and also, Geordie said in his video about the idea of the Greens having no issue with capitalism. They want to manage it. They want to present a nicer, kinder, greener version of capitalism. What would you we might have touched on this before.
Said,
what do you think of that?
I think there are some people in the Greens who think that, but I don't think that's reflective of everyone in the Greens. And I certainly don't, and particularly, I don't actually think it's reflective of the people who have, I was going to say power, but also just the people doing the work in the Greens right now, like the people who are making the Greens what it is right now, what this movement is, which is what we're doing. I think they are critics of capitalism. And so I think
certainly neoliberalism, right? Like I think a very broad consensus across the party will talk about neoliberalism as the big enemy, but whether others go further, be like, well, capitalism itself is neoliberalism is sort of another word just for what capitalism has been for the past 50 years. Yeah.
Even the MPs though, like we probably skirting too close to the edge if we were to name, but like if you think about the MPs and how many of them, if you ask them, like personal view, do you think capitalism is bad? I reckon you'd have a majority saying yes.
Yes, totally. Yes, well, yes, Jordan Still John is an explicit socialist. He's told me as such. We know that they're explicit.
We're going through the list. Okay.
I'm just pointing out the ones that have said to me at least that they're socialists on the record on my podcast, not just private conversations. Yes, the Queensland MPs as well. They're out there. Those fucking dirty reds are everywhere. Those watermelons are everywhere.
They really are. They really are. I just quickly, because I said, I think at the top, I was like, I feel like there's also a hint of conspiratorialism. I've had people sending me like screenshots of, I don't know if they're like group chats or what's going on, but people are saying, all the MPs in party room are pissed off at Shoebridge and no one was consulted and he just like snuck this through. And I don't think I don't know. I guess maybe that's possible. It doesn't really seem to be the case to me. From what I understand, this went through like a pretty lengthy consultation process. First of all, it's based on the Greens policies, which go through now I've forgotten how was it Annabelle Crabb described consensus decision making, but like long consultation processes with members of the Greens to agree on the policies, which include, I'll read them out just for the record. The deployment of Australian Defence Forces must only be for defence of Australia, emergency relief and international peacekeeping. Decisions on defence procurement should be based solely on Australia's territorial defence needs, and ADF should be equipped, trained and resourced to meet Australia's peacekeeping commitments and self-defence needs, and at AIM 45, defence procurements that do not restrict the operations of the ADF by increased reliance on any one country. That's all reflected. That's what this policy is, right? Like it's reducing reliance on other countries, and it pursues an ADF that exists, but it is equipped, trained, and resourced to meet our peacekeeping commitments and self-defence needs.
Yeah.
So that's consistent with the policies that are endorsed by all Greens members through that consensus process, and it's also been endorsed by like groups like the Independent and Peaceful Australia Network, IPAN, and some of the most staunch kind of anti-war activists that I know who are like extremely involved in, Free Palestine protests and pacifism. They support this policy. Like they say, yes, this is what it looks like when you replace an aggressive and imperialist defense policy with something that is actually genuinely defensive. But my favorite conspiracy theory is that like they got David Shoebridge to announce this policy because he is so like vocally anti-war, and that was provided as like cover for this heinously pro-war policy. I mean, yeah, I don't know. I guess what I'm getting to is I think it's true that the party was like caught a little bit off guard by the response to this. And I agree that probably members could have been better prepared for the response that was going to come from the left when it is kind of it's a new thing. The Greens have never before announced a policy like this. That probably should have been foreseen, and it probably should have, members should have been briefed. I think members were ultimately offered a briefing, but I don't know if that was after or before the announcement.
Yeah.
So, yeah, but I don't think it's some like secret crazy thing that's now tearing the party apart.
Certainly not. No, and yeah, it's good to know, to go through the details. I'll be honest, like I was a little bit like, oh boy. I was like,
Me too.
oh God,
I was like,
I'm going to have to talk
what?
about this on Serious Danger, for fuck's sake. and looking into it, again, hopefully it's not hackery at work, but like a genuine reassurance, or a better understanding at least, of what the policy is. And I will commend Shoebridge and the party on being on the front foot in this stuff. Like if we're not talking about our different vision for defense and conflict right now, when there's a goddamn genocide happening that Australia is complicit in, with the Russia-Ukraine situation, with warmongering across the board, with the two major parties constantly saying we need more and more defense, and there's endless amounts of money for this shit while we keep people in poverty and fail to deliver the public services that people want and deserve. If we're not talking about this now actively, not just having a platform that we all like and stuff that we don't talk about too much, but actively putting it out there and trying to push that stuff, then what's the point,
Yeah. So
now,
true.
Would you say, could we expect more from, like we know how political attacks work or political debate works. Victorian Socialists will not go into the detail of this policy and sort of give us our fair due. They will say, vote for us because the Greens have capitulated to the right and they want more missiles and drones, and may just, flash up a headline and say, see, look at this.
Yeah.
The Greens are sold out, vote for us. Do you think that's coming? And
I wonder
what can we do about it?
Like, I'm sure there was a turning point in history where the Greens did their first attack flyer on Labor, right? And so if and when VS does their attack flyer on the Greens, if that's something that they do, that would be a strategic question for them, I suppose. But on it, I probably would say Greens announced $4 billion or Greens are spending $4 billion on new drones and missiles. So, and that's,
and that's facts.
That's their prerogative, really. That's genuinely, I mean that sounds like whatever, and obviously it would annoy me, but that's how electoralism works. If you think that that's going to help you win votes, then that's what you would do.
So be it. Hey, drag us if you think we're being ridiculous here. If you're outraged by this particular policy and you think there's a different angle on it,
drag Tom.
Whoa! What?
Not me.
Errol did a lot of homework on this. She's done great.
Tom wrote every word. If you didn't like it, Tom wrote it, and I just read it out.
I got famously anti-war Errol host to lead the episode to confuse you. That was my policy. You can always send us a message on Patreon. We love hearing from our patrons. Message us through the platform or send us an email, hello@seriousdangerpod.com. Follow us on all the social medias and such. And happy election campaigning, everyone. The election's happening, Emerald. It's democracy.
It's democracy. Well, I was door knocking and this woman was like, we just had an election. There's just too many. I was like, you're telling me. You're telling me.
Honey, you're telling me.
Hello.
All right, thanks, everyone. Bomb everything. Bye-bye.
Serious Danger Australia.